Hello, welcome to Cod's Galley. I'm Cod President Paul Ferrace, and we're back with another Cod program on our great crew from World War II. Now, submarines had at least 3 cooks. We had one cook that would do breakfast, one that would do dinner in the middle of the day, and one would take over supper at night. And we had a whole bunch of cooks who served the best food the Navy could provide during World War II. And maybe Evan will be able to have a little list of their names at some point, and we'll give honor and credit to all of the men who served as cooks on board Cod, including guys like George WWII. But we're going to talk about one in particular, George Sacko, who was from Hoboken, that area, a good Sicilian American. This is one of the rare photos of a cook slash baker in a fleet submarine galley. And that's our George Sacko on the 7th Patrol. And this is my homage to George. I have to point out that I am not going to wear a t-shirt today on Cod, given the temperature aboard. He's wearing his apron around his waist, and he's wearing a t-shirt. He's got a Chesterfield in his hand. We're going to do a close-up insert here. So I don't smoke, but there's the Chesterfields in case he comes back. But we know this picture was taken sometime between midnight and 4 a.m., known as the mid-watch. We know that just because right here under his elbow are bread pans with bread dough rising. George was the designated baker. One of the 3 cooks would be the designated baker, and that fell to George because George was a commercial baker before the Navy got him. So he had no problem cranking out the bread. Bread and all the baking was done on the mid-watch, midnight to 4 a.m. So that's why when I did my restoration of the galley, it's set up. Now the 2 bread pans, they have risen, and they've been baked. Now, these are not World War II Navy bread pans. In fact, this is polystyrene bread, and somebody broke the bottom. So let's just say after all these years, that bread is past its date. But George is using his Hobart A120 mixer. And here's an A120 mixer. Sadly, ours was lost at some point in Cod's career, but we were able to obtain an identical mixer. Got to tell you a funny story. By the way, in a minute, you're going to be hearing the voice of George Sacko. But George, working at a small commercial bakery before the war, did not have the luxury of such modern motorized equipment as a mixer, especially with a dough hook. They were mixing their dough by hand, maybe with a wooden paddle, and you can see this guy's got some pretty good forearms. Very hairy, by the way, so a little extra hair in your bread. You knew George baked it. But anyway, George, when he came aboard Cod on her commissioning, he was happy and surprised to see a mixer and took to it like a fish to water. But within a month or 2, he started hearing a grinding noise, and he would smell something burning. And then when he was making up the dough for the next day's bread, it froze up and stopped, and it was smoking. And he panicked and called in Frank Kimball, our engineering officer, and said, "Frank, something's wrong. The thing broke." And he said, "Well, how can that be? It's a brand new mixer." And so they brought out the manual, and the engineering officer and George start going through it. And he said, the voltages and the plugs are all right. He said, now, what type of grease did you pack the bearings in? And George said, "What?" Apparently, the mixers were shipped right from the factory without grease in the bearing drivetrain, and that was one of the first things you were supposed to do before using it. And poor George, not having had that experience, being a brand new submarine, freshly minted submariner, had no idea that you had to pack the bearings with grease. So they were able to get some spare bearings, and they put some grease in there, and it worked perfectly. So that's a funny little story that George told me. He was sweating bullets because he said, the pay for a cook third class was not enough to pay for a brand new mixer. But I want to talk about baking bread. So George was a sweetheart of a guy. I had the opportunity to talk to him on a number of occasions. So even though there were at least a dozen or more, but perhaps even 24 cooks who called this space home, we think of it as George Sacko's place, simply because we had the opportunity to talk to him. We have a picture of him, and we're going to share a recording of him. But so the bakers would bake from the midnight to 4 a.m. And if you've ever done any baking, you start out with a big pan and you mix your flour. We got some pans in here ready to go. You've got flour. Now, if you can show these down here, Evan, these are ready service bins, and each one has a specific content. I'm going to pull this one back. Luckily, they're marked. So this is coffee. This is where you'd be storing your coffee, and after 80 years, the hinges are a little gummy, and so there's a little trick to getting that closed. We'll have to talk to Dave and Ben. This one is flour. Here it is. So inside here, kid, you're too efficient. I'm reaching down in here to grab my flour thing. So you'd scoop out flour, throw it in your pan. We're going to leave the pan up there. Throw it in the pan. You'd put your baking soda, your yeast, and water, and you'd mix that up and dump it into here in the bowl. And then start mixing it around, making the basic dough. And when you had the dough just right, you'd put it into pans. Now, thanks to Rich McKelney of the Pampanito, those guys are really on top of restoration of their galley. They've obtained the 4-slot bread pans, and I can tell you they're roughly double the length. And they fit in the 2 ovens. They use the space perfectly. Again, not having done this recently, I'm going to open their oven. Okay, we've got some heating elements in there and some phony fruit, but that's the oven. You can see you could probably put two bread dough racks in there to bake at any one time. We're going to close that up. It's probably the other one that's a better one to have opened. But anyways, the dough rises and you put it in there and you bake it. Now, the bread comes out, it's baked, you need to let it cool. And if you're baking anything like sweet rolls or cinnamon rolls, they have to cool as well. And George could pretty much keep control security-wise of the galley. In fact, Evan, when you back up, don't fall backwards, but step out in the companionway, and I'll show you. So electric boat company subs don't have the pass-through here because the griddles are here. On Portsmouth design boats, the griddles are forward, so then the cabinet top is on the aft end, and you can pass things through. But EB, that's not the way we do things. They had a fold-down thing right here so you could put the food or whatever and have the mess cranks take it and serve it. Well, he could put this down and keep people out, and I think maybe, well, you could always grab a rolling pin and beat people. But anyway, you had to let the bread cool down. I'm going to just put this up here. You had to let the bread cool down, but you didn't want people grabbing it because, let's face it, midnight to 4 a.m. watch. Later in the Cold War, they had mid-rats. We had something similar to that. We didn't call it mid-rats in World War II, but you had to cool the bread down. Now, you could put it in a box, but if it's a closed, dark box, that active yeast is going to mold up pretty quickly. So for those of you that haven't been aboard or seen our tour, Evan's going to move aft, and we're going to show you the bread locker. Now, in the cruise mess, I'm going to get past Evan. We have 8 benches for our tables. This bench on all fleet boats, at least all electric boat fleet boats, it's always the one under the hatch for some reason. This is the designated bread locker. Evan, you want to picture these air holes. It allows circulation. And there is some phony bread from Amazon. Now again, I'm going to put these 2 loaves together to kind of simulate the length of the standard Navy loaf of bread. So we are cranking out bread in loaves roughly that long. And you put them down in here, and it's got a hasp. You can lock that. So the bread can then cool down with air circulation. It's not going to get too humid in there, and it's not going to mold up, which active yeast, if you've ever done baking, wow, if you put a freshly baked bread in a plastic bag and cinch it off, believe me, in 24 hours you've got moldy bread. So this allowed you to cool your bread and not have greasy-handed submariners grabbing at it. Of course, you'd throw some out for them. So I'm going to put our Amazon bread. It has a wonderful vanilla smell, which is pretty cool. By the way, something about electric boat benches, they're different than the Portsmouth benches. You want to hold the seat or the lid up without having it fall down. So these hatches, these hinges here, will hold it up and keep it from folding back or down on your fingers. So you do that. Now, the problem, it's not really a problem, I think it's a blessing being a Sicilian myself. George was able to crank out a whole lot of bread. And more than this could accommodate. So what do you do with that extra bread? Well, they took the general store locker here. This was a general locker for whatever. And they cut this hole here and put a screen in there. And this became George's auxiliary bread locker. So it could circulate air and keep whatever was in there out of the hands of crewmen until the next day when it could be served. So, by the way, this bothered me for years before I got to talk to George Sacko. The level of workmanship on a fleet submarine is very good. And this is something I would have done. You know, I flunked shop in junior high. So that kind of bothered me. Why was that cut with the screen there? And then in my conversations with George, he mentioned the fact that he baked so much bread that he exceeded the capacity of the bread locker seat. And he said they converted a locker into a bread locker. And I said, George, how do you do that? And he said, well, they cut a rectangular hole and put a screen in there. And suddenly the great mystery was solved. And by the way, so long after George and the rest of the World War II guys go back to their civilian lives, cod is put into mothballs. Then in 51, it's brought out of mothballs again and put back into service. And this remains the auxiliary bread locker. We've had conversations with our World War II, not our World War II, but our Cold War crew, and they mentioned that, yep, this served as their auxiliary bread locker. Sadly, I found out that the problem of cleanliness on the boat kind of slipped at some point. George said they didn't have a problem with cockroaches in World War II, but apparently sometime in the recommissioning from 51 to 52, roaches found their way aboard. And one of our crewmen who was aboard recently said, oh yeah, the auxiliary bread locker, he said, you know, this is where we went to grab rolls or extra bread. He said, but we always knew to, before we opened it, to tap on it and then open it. And I said, why did you tap on it? He says, to scare the roaches away so that, you know, they didn't have to fight us for whatever we wanted to grab out of that. So I'm sure George is spinning in his grave hearing that. But baking is very important, as sure all you submariners know out there. You know, food is one of the big and one of the only perks you get underway. And of course, modern submariners, they have really good bakers and mid-rats and all kinds of wonderful stuff. In World War II, they set that tradition, but it wasn't. It was a challenge. And you're going to hear from George. We'll have a montage of some great images of cod and other boats as our way of honoring submarine cooks. And you'll be hearing George's description that was recorded before his death to share with cod visitors about basically how it was to be a cook on the cod, as well as how some of the challenges he had baking a cake, and cakes were another important factor, and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to come back to say so long, but let's hear from George.
Hello, I am George J. Sacko, Ship's Cook First Class. I was very fortunate to be a member of the Cod's commissioning party. After 7 successful war patrols, we brought her back to the States and decommissioned her. With the help of 2 cooks and a number of mess cooks, we were able to feed 95 men, 3 meals a day from this tiny but very efficient galley. We knew that a well-fed crew was a happy crew, and we did our best to achieve that. Records show that we did. One of our duties was to make sure we had plenty of bread and cold cuts on hand to make sandwiches for the crew in case we went into the battle station submerged for a long period of time. So that we could not make a hot meal for the crew, we'd have to give them sandwiches. This happened a few times. Our rangers had securing rods so that when the pots and pans would stay in place while cooking. This took care of the roll of the sub, but when we dove or surfaced, the cook on duty would have to steady the pots and pans so the contents would not spill out. As the baker aboard, many times I would put cakes in the oven, and before the batter would set, we would crash dive. The down angle would cause the batter to spill forward so that the cake would come out 1 inch on one side and 3 inches on the other. They were still edible, and the crew knew what caused the lopsided dessert. We had an enjoyable time of trying to make a varied menu so we could please the whole crew. And after a long patrol, we were very happy to head for port for some well-deserved rest and rehabilitation.
Well, I hope you found that enjoyable to hear our good friend George talking to us about his experiences on cod. Again, George is always a part of our galley here, simply because we don't have any other photos of our cooks at work. But we'll be coming back in the future with more programs talking about how it is you cook for 90 plus men in this tiny space. And it is a marvel of time, space, motion engineering. We'll talk about that. But one thing I do want to share, and this came from George, maybe because he worked from midnight to 4 a.m. baking, he was probably just going straight into breakfast. One of the things that George told me was that fresh eggs would last at best 3 weeks in the chill box, and then you had to switch to powdered eggs. But he said one of the tricks that he learned from the old hands was the last dozen eggs, when you broke them and did whatever you wanted to do, if it's an omelet or sunny side up, they would save the last dozen egg shells and have them perhaps, on this fold down thing here. I'm just going to go ahead and deploy that. They would have this available. Kind of maybe you'd see that while he's making breakfast, long after the fresh eggs have gone, and he's using powdered eggs, so that crewmen, when they came by to sit down and have their breakfast, would just normally assume that we still have fresh eggs when they're getting the powdered eggs. So that was George's little trick. Again, it was a common trick of submariners. As it turns out, a lot of the crewmen said, we knew the difference between powdered eggs and fresh eggs, but we didn't want to complain because it was the only option they had. So again, our salute to George Sacko and all the cooks, including, as I said, George Werback. We're in touch with his son and some of the other cooks, their families. We salute them all. We're just blessed to have this great picture of George, and I'm wearing this. And no way are my arms as hairy as his. But George, thank you very much. The crew loved your cooking. Now remember to hit the like, subscribe, notification bell, and we'll be back with more. Thank you.